Hi. Um, I am so glad to be here tonight. Most of you know me as the owner of Omnivore Books, the Bay Area's only culinary bookshop. And you know that I love cookbooks, especially old and rare ones. A lot of you, though, may not know my background in this. For many years, I was a rare book specialist at an auction house here in San Francisco called Pacific Book Auction Galleries. What I got to do was research the books to see what made them valuable. And when a consignor gave us an entire collection, I got to take a deep dive into the material. For me, this was rabbit hole heaven. A 7-volume Civil War diary in which the author wrapped up one passage by writing, "And thus concluded the Battle of Gettysburg, and I hope to never see such a battle again." I read stacks of gold rush letters home, describing the poor, filthy conditions in the makeshift mining towns, and I can guarantee that every letter writer described rampant gambling and prostitution, but assured the reader that he was taking no such part in these activities himself. We once got in the entire archive of Henry Miller, basically his file cabinets. It was incredible. There were letters from Anais Nin and Erica Jong, Lawrence Durrell. They were very fun. Most of them were trying to show off how much sex they had had so that he would be impressed. I bought a whole number of them. There were heartbreaking letters from his early Paris lover, June, from a mental hospital describing her lonely old age. There was a letter Henry Miller just wrote to his young son, Tony, for his young son, Tony, to Santa Claus one year, which I also bought. There were also his own typed essays of his youth in New York, dancing at Roseland with the girls and taking the streetcar to neighborhoods his mother had banned him from exploring. In short, I love to get to know someone through their writing. So when, about 5 years ago, I purchased a collection of about 800 community cookbooks from around the country, most dating from the 1880s to the 1920s, I couldn't wait to dive in and start researching them. Today, most people remember community cookbooks as the spiral-bound homemade ones that their mothers had on their kitchen shelves, recipes for guava jam and cherry pie and chicken tetrazzini. But these cookbooks were so much more than just a catalog of recipes. They were fundraisers, political pamphlets, and historical accounts of the communities they served. In America, the first charity cookbook was published in 1864 to subsidize medical costs for Union soldiers injured during the Civil War. Like that one, most began as a way to raise funds for a common goal and were published either by church groups to rebuild or remodel their church, or schools or homes for impoverished or orphaned children. I love the early ones, published before mass transportation and refrigeration, because they speak to the local foods of the place they were published. While the Eskimo cookbook by the students of the Shishmaref Day School in Anchorage had recipes for soured seal liver, bear paws, walrus stew, and lingcod Eskimo ice cream, a 1919 Alabama cookbook called Culinary Crinkles contained instructions for making pork sausage, pea pod soup, Mrs. George R. Ward's sliced sweet potato pie, sunflower marmalade, preserved watermelon citron, and sweet peach pickle. Yeah, sounds really good. Even as transportation and refrigeration made many recipes ubiquitous across the country, every one of them had their favorite banana salad and pineapple ambrosia with maraschino cherries. There were still ways to find out what made the place unique. My goal, of course, was to sell these and point out what made each special, so I'd first look at the game and preserves chapters. No matter how modern, those chapters were still going to be about what was local to shoot or pick. The 1961 Alaska Wild Game Cookbook contained recipes for moose mincemeat pecan bars, baked spruce hens, sour cream deer chops, reindeer scallopini, savory roast mountain goat, etc. A special mushroom section contained detailed illustrations and descriptions for foraging for Alaskan delicacies. A mid-century Colorado cookbook might have a high-altitude recipe for baking or rhubarb jam, And sometimes I just have to give up and admit defeat, as I did in my description of the recipes of the Women's Society of the First Congregational Church of Denver from 1926. The 20s were kind of like the worst time for these cookbooks. This is how I wrote my description in my catalog entry, quote, "This was the nadir of our cooking history in America, and it is proved out here. Sausages with fried bananas, Irish tamale, coconut Creole souffle, cornflake kisses, and other early attempts at fusion cuisine." Sometimes, if I could find nothing special about the recipes, I'd research the place it was written or detail the ads for local businesses in the book, which could give the reader an idea of what a small town was like an early Nevada silver mining town with ads for local banks and mining equipment and Chinese restaurants. And sometimes, if a name of a contributor sounded unique, I'd Google it. Of course, all the contributors were women, and all the names were their husbands with a Mrs. before it. So here's where my research led me with the Home Cookbook of Detroit, published in 1917 by the Tower Bible class of the Mack Avenue Evangelical Church. Again, there was nothing particularly special about the recipes, so I thought I'd look into the congregation. You know, maybe they were African American or immigrants from Armenia. 1917 was when the genocide happened. Who knows? One of the regular contributors was a Mrs. Leon Briner, and that name sounded unusual enough that a quick search of the name and the city would probably turn up something. The story I uncovered was fascinating. In 1925, 8 years after this was published, Gladys and Ossian Sweet were the first African-American couple to move into a white middle-class neighborhood in Detroit. Their appearance caused an uproar in the neighborhood, and for 2 nights, mobs gathered outside their home to protest. The first night, the Sweets huddled alone in their new house, afraid for their lives as rocks struck their windows. The second night, they invited over 7 friends, all men, who brought their guns, ready to defend the Sweets and themselves in the upstairs bedrooms. The shades were drawn, but with all the shouting and rock throwing and terror, confusion reigned. Before long, shots were fired from the upstairs window. One rioter was injured below, and a man protesting on the porch across the street was shot in the back and killed. That was Mr. Leon Briner. Remember, this is 8 years after his wife published her recipes in this book. It turns out that this was a huge case in Detroit, and Clarence Darrow took on the defendants as clients. Because the blinds were drawn, he argued, no one could be sure who had fired the shots. After an impassioned final argument, the result was a hung jury. On appeal, Darrow repeated his defense and also managed to keep getting the case put off on technicalities until it made it out of the headlines and people moved on to other news. He finally prevailed, with an all-white jury finding the Sweets innocent, which was obviously remarkable, especially at the time. I mean, this kind of thing happens today, you know? It's very hard for white juries to find black men innocent. The Sweet trial became part and parcel of the changing fabric of Detroit. The church that now stands in place of the Mack Avenue Evangelical Church is now an African-American church. But whether Mrs. Briner's corn pudding stands the test of time is an entirely different question.